right, good evening and welcome once again to the Institute Colloquium, which is becoming a regular feature on Friday evenings at 5:15. So today we have Pushkar Sohoni. It's a great pleasure to welcome him. He's our local boy, literally. He's raised in Pune, studied in Pune until he went abroad. So I will spare you all the details. In fact, I just realized today that he's probably the only faculty who has a Wikipedia page. So you can go back and check about him. But I know he's a great speaker. He's a wonderful colleague. And, so it's a great pleasure to welcome him to deliver the colloquium. With that, Pushkar, it's all yours.
That was a record introduction anyway. Thank you all for being here. For IISER students, I know from Monday we have exams, so thank you all for being here when exams are just a few days away. And welcome to all the guests from outside. I'm very happy to see a lot of my colleagues and students and also some friends in the audience. I am the only speaker in this series this year, I think, who will not be talking about science. I'll be talking about history instead, and how we can recover history from the study of basically what used to be called archaeological remains or monuments, but architectural remains of various kinds. I was also told that it's a general lecture, so it's very difficult to cater to such a mixed audience. So for those of you who are well versed with history, and I might be saying things that you're well aware of, please bear with me, but there are pretty pictures to keep you entertained. I'll ensure nobody falls asleep in the course of the next hour. And lastly, for all those who are sitting close to the aisle because you have to leave early or you might want to leave early, there are expensive seats up front, so feel free to avail of those. So let me start by saying why history and why study history. And the big reason is, it used to be believed that history was a narrative about the past, which was a simple narrative. You looked at various kinds of data. You looked at documents, you looked at buildings, you looked at coins, and so on. This was very incomplete data, but you tried to piece it together and create some kind of story about the past. And there was a kind of positivist thinking which said, history is like science, out there, and it's just a question of uncovering it and discovering the truth. Increasingly, what we've realized is that every time we consciously write history, we actually are also giving a reflection of the present. So the same data, which might have been available in 1900, if it's available today, would yield very different understandings of the past. So a study of history is not only a window into the time period that you study, but it's also a window into your own time, and that's very important. Now, histories have always been biased towards relying on textual sources. And so this is one text which is particularly pertinent for the region that we are in and we are going to talk about today, the Deccan. This is a text called the Tarikh-e-Firishta, one manuscript copy of it. And this was written in the early 17th century by a gentleman who grew up in Ahmednagar, but in the 1590s, there was a big fight, and we'll talk about this, between people of Iranian origin and people who were local. And he had to flee to Bijapur. And he went and completed this book of his at the court of Bijapur. And of course, when he describes certain kinds of events, like a battle between the king of Bijapur and the king of Ahmednagar from where he had to flee, we can imagine which way his biases are. And this is the problem with textual sources, is that they lie. And unless you understand the complete context in which texts were written, it's very difficult to read them. You can't take them at face value. There are all kinds of implicit biases, some deliberate, some not so deliberate, and so on. But so as opposed to relying on textual histories alone, I personally choose to go with material sources of data to construct histories. And material sources sometimes do contain a bit of text, like epigraphs, which is inscriptions on stone. You have coins, which yield incredible amounts of data there are all kinds of daily artifacts like pottery and so on, which you get from archaeological contexts. You have paintings, and we'll talk about a couple of these paintings later. And you also have architecture, which in many ways I believe is the most truthful of all these sources, because it takes an enormous investment of money and time and will to build anything. And so architecture has to embody a certain kind of reality which a text does not necessarily have to do. Now, as an architectural historian, I tend to believe buildings a lot more. This is a drawing that a friend and colleague of mine, Narendra Dengle, did, which talks of how architecture embodies all kinds of human activities, which eventually get mixed and distilled and create some kind of architectural creation, a building. And to start with the architectural source and unravel it, reverse engineer it, requires a certain kind of knowledge of all these other things which have fed into it. And so that becomes the real trick, to look at a building and try and unravel all kinds of thoughts from all kinds of fields which might have gone into designing and then eventually building it. And so today I'll talk about Ahmednagar, mostly because for about 10 years I worked on the city of Ahmednagar, the Sultanate of Ahmednagar. For those of you who haven't been there, it's only, it's about less than 3 hours away. So do pay a visit. There are fantastic things to see there. And what we can learn about the aspirations, the technology, the court culture of the Nizam Shahs of Ahmednagar, the rulers of Ahmednagar, is what we'll look at today. And so let's start with first this area called the Deccan, because the story is set here. Now, all of us know that the Deccan roughly is this area bounded by the Narmada Tapi valleys on the north, the Mysore Gap on the south, and the eastern and the western Ghats. But the Deccan has had a very tenuous connection with North India for most of its existence. And that is because traditionally there were only two routes by which you could move from North India into the Deccan. Those two routes were the Mandu Gap and the Burhanpur Gap. And whoever controlled those typically had access to the south. Now, in a north-centric world, to everybody north of the Vindhyas, everything south of the Vindhyas was the Deccan. But to those in the Deccan, everything north of the Vindhyas was called Hindustan, and everything south of Mysore was called Karnataka. And so you had a nomenclature that you get at from that period, from the people who live here, who already understand the world very different. They understand it as the Vilayat of Hindustan, a completely different province. The Deccan also has had a completely different life of its own, because it's relied very heavily on maritime connections to the rest of the world. Unlike North India, which was connected very heavily and thickly with land routes that went into Central Asia, from there into China, into the Middle East, and so on, the Deccan was connected by a string of ports, mostly along the west coast, but a small number along the east coast as well. And so you have descriptions from the 1st century AD, from the Periplus, which names a number of ports that were visited by Roman visitors, and most of them have been identified. So we typically have 3 sets of names. You have an Indic name like Bhrigukacha, which will become Bharuch, and then it might be anglicized to Broch and Romanized to something else. So it's been a great exercise of 200 years trying to collate various sets of names, but most of these places have been identified. But it just gives you the kind of, again, thick network that the Deccan sat in the middle of. It was not isolated. It might be isolated from North India, but it's not isolated from the world. And so there have been only 3 or 4 attempts at unifying Hindustan and the Deccan. And the first one we know happens with the Mauryas, when they start putting up, after Ashoka, a number of rock edicts all across the subcontinent. And though we don't understand the exact extent nor nature of their territorial control, we know they exercise enough control to put up these edicts in Buddhist columns. The Guptas never actually control the Deccan. They instead marry into a family called the Vakatakas, who rule over the Deccan. This is the family that patronizes caves at Ajanta and so on. After the Mauryas, the first serious attempt seems to be Alauddin Khilji, who does make inroads deep into the south. And later on, his successor or dynasty in a continuum, the Tughlaqs, again managed to capture most of India and keep it under their control, but for less than 50 years. And that's always the problem. The minute you move down south, the north rebels, and they start fragmenting into small kingdoms. You have to move north, subdue them, and then the south revolts. And this is a pattern we've seen time and again. It also happens with the Mughals, because after this is in the 14th century. After this, in the 17th century, the Mughals will do the same thing, and their whole empire will come apart in that effort. But Muhammad bin Tughlaq, madman or visionary or whatever people think of him, did move his capital from Delhi to Daulatabad, had the population march down. A lot of them died, and then because they were unhappy, had them march back up, and then the rest of them died. I think some of them did survive, but it was pretty brutal. Anyway, he couldn't keep his kingdom together at all. And in the last years of his life, the whole empire that he's painstakingly cobbled together, spending his whole life in campaigns, putting down rebellions, conquering new lands, trying to increase revenue bases, all that goes to pot, because what happens is regional governors that he's appointed in all these places will rebel, revolt in various stages and declare themselves kings of new kingdoms. So suddenly, you have these two brothers who worked for him, Harihara and Bukka, who set up a kingdom called Vijayanagar. You have the Bahmani sultans who rebel at Daulatabad, the erstwhile capital of the Yadavas, Devgiri, and they set up their own kingdom. But the person they elect is deposed within 2 years, and a new person comes to the fore, somebody called Hasan Gangu Bahmani, and he becomes the first king of the Bahmani kingdom. But you have a similar rebellion in Bengal, in Gujarat, in Malwa, in Jaunpur. The list is endless. In Madurai, there is a Sultanate of Madurai, which lasts for about half a century. And you have all these kingdoms led by people who have been appointed by him, by Muhammad bin Tughlaq, as regional governors. Some of these people were reconfirmed by him, so they were not people who came with him, but were regional lords. And he said, you've been good, you've helped me with this conquest, so why don't I make you the local ruler here? And as soon as he's gone, the person realizes this is a good time to say, I'm completely independent. And the mechanisms for declaring independence were complicated, because one of the things you did was you issued coins in your name. The second thing you did was you were allowed the privilege of riding an elephant. So you have all these different markers. And you kind of keep pushing the limit till somebody complains and you say, well, I'm not really rebelling. And then when the person's back is turned, you again declare rebellion in small doses, in small measures. In any case, this will be the period we really look at where you have this Sultanate of Ahmednagar. And this is when the Bahmani kingdom breaks up. You have these 5 sultanates in the Deccan, of which we will look at the Nizam Shahs. Eventually, the Mughal juggernaut will sweep through, take over most of the subcontinent, and then lose it all within 50 years of doing so. Again, a pattern that we've seen time and again. And so, if you look at what happens in the 1330s, when Muhammad bin Tughlaq's empire is falling apart, you have this big area in the Deccan and also in parts of the Karnataka, controlled by these kings of Vijayanagara, who are ruling from their capital at Hampi. And over here, you have a kingdom, a dynasty called the Bahmanis, who will rule from their capital at Gulbarga for a while, and in the mid-15th century, they'll move their capital to Bidar, and we'll look at some things there. Now, Vijayanagar and the Bahmani kingdom are born under the same circumstances. Essentially, they are a fallout of the disintegration of the kingdom of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. and they start behaving in the same way. And so by behavior, they are trying to be part of the same greater cosmopolis. And the cosmopolis was an idea introduced by Sheldon Pollock a decade and a half ago, a powerful idea that says, let's not look at cultural formations in terms of states, but let's look at it in terms of larger shared cultures, like texts that circulate, people that circulate. You have certain ideas, a prestige language that is shared amongst everybody. And of course, you have ideas of kingship, and it really grows not through conquest, but by people wanting to emulate this culture. And this is what you see, what is called the Persianate Age, a book that came out by Richard Eaton very recently, India in the Persianate Age. So there used to be something called a Sanskrit cosmopolis, which means a large part of South Asia, Southeast Asia used to share a number of traits and features. But now you have a different kind of cosmopolis, the Persianate cosmopolis, which stretches all the way from Konya in Anatolia in Turkey, where you have, everybody's heard of this Sufi poet called Rumi. He lives in Turkey, but he's writing poetry in Persian. In similar ways, a saint in Bengal will also write poetry in Persian, because this is the prestige language that connects them. They are reading the same things, and they have an enormous ecumenical culture that they share. And we have this in a very important essay by an author called Philip Wagner, where there is a visitor who comes from Samarkand to Vijayanagar and starts describing what happens at the court. And he finds out that the king of Vijayanagar is dressing in ways that are very similar to what people do in Iran. And he's also using the same words. And then you have this fantastic description where the king of Vijayanagar calls himself the Suratrana, which is a Sanskritization of the word sultan. He says, I am the Hindu Raya Suratrana, which means I am the Sultan of Indian kings. And so again, this is a desire to be a participant in a much larger cosmopolis, a big international world that gives you trans-regional prestige. And Persian will stay as the language of courts right till the 19th century. Even when the British and the Marathas correspond with each other, for example, they will use Persian as their language. In any case, to be part of this cosmopolis, what the Bahmanis do is start inviting a lot of men of letters, people who are trained in building, in writing, scholars, to come to their kingdom in northern Karnataka and western Maharashtra. And even the famous poet Hafiz was supposed to have come, but then he got seasick and went back. There's a long story, we won't get distracted here. But the kinds of people they're bringing over are also bringing with them all kinds of construction expertise. And to fit into this larger international world, this Persian cosmopolis, you have to build like the rest of the people. That's how you show off your equivalency. And so they really import a lot of Iranian architects and also know-how. I mean, this kind of tile work, which you might find in Central Asia, Iran, you rarely see in India. But this is one of those periods where you'll see it really flourish. But not to be left out, Vijayanagar will do exactly the same things. They will also build buildings that you cannot describe as local. They are also trying to fit in that world, building with domes and arches and using a whole architectural vocabulary that really belongs elsewhere. And it results in some pretty interesting hybrid forms like this one. This, by the way, is a mosque of one of their generals, somebody called Ahmad Khan, which is built like you would expect buildings in Vijayanagar to be built. So the king is trying to fit into an international world, while their general is very happy being part of a much more local world. You also have building types, architectural programs that you've never had before. So this is a period, the 14th century onwards, when you start having, on a large scale, mosques, baths, hammams. You start having garden pavilions everywhere, and we'll look at some of them, and tombs. And since these architectural programs are completely new to the Deccan, there is no vocabulary for them. So you are borrowing designs from elsewhere, but building them in very local ways, again resulting in strange hybrids. Along with architectural programs, you also get a lot of technologies that come in. The first big technology is that of gun casting, and using gunpowder. And so everybody has learned that Babur in 1526 uses gunpowder for the first time at the Battle of Panipat. Well, Babur actually is not the first, because at the Battle of Belgaum in 1472, you have mention of the use of gunpowder, where the Bahmanis lay siege to the fort, lay down mines, and blow it up with gunpowder. In any case, you have enormous expertise in casting guns in the Deccan, so much so that when the Portuguese first come to Goa, they find there are gun casters who are so good that they write back to the king and say, these people seem to be really good, should we get a couple of them back? We thought we were good. And they do take a couple of gun casters from the Deccan back to Lisbon. You also have, well, on the right is one of the more famous cannons. If you don't know it, it's called the Malik-e-Maidan, which was the largest cannon, and we'll talk more about that. You also have resulting changes in fortification. And this is a feature that gets added on to fort walls with the introduction of gunpowder, so that even with cannon or mines, you cannot tunnel and blow up the base of the actual wall, which is behind. It also gives you 2 lines of defense. You have a moat. And then on this side, you have sloping ground called a glacis. And this glacis prevents people from gauging the height of the fort, because the sight line is like this till you come to the edge. You don't know how deep the moat is or how tall the walls are. And if you bring up cannon here, usually the cannon shot will go right over. And all these innovations you start seeing in the late 1400s, early 1500s, under a very able minister of the Bahmanis called Mahmud Gawan Gilani, who's also called the Malik al-Tujar. He's the prince of traders, and he is of Iranian descent. And his presence causes a lot of trouble at the Bahmani court, and that's where the Nizam Shahs will begin. I'll just tell you that in a minute. Let me also quickly mention that the other technology that comes in a big way is water management. Till this period, all cities have always been built on riverbanks, places where you can find water easily. Suddenly, with the introduction of piped conveyance of water, of kanats, you start having cities sited in places where you could never have had cities before. And Ahmednagar is a case in point. Ahmednagar could not have been a viable city because there is no perennial river close by. It could only have been a set of small village settlements. It could become a city in the 15th century because there was this technology of bringing water from multiple sources as far away as 15 kilometers. And these are the kinds of siphon towers that you see that punctuate these lines, and most of them are being decimated as we speak. In any case, this Mahmud Gawan is very important because he brings in this kind of technology, but he also brings statecraft. And he also imports a lot of people from Iran through his mercantile connections. And the people that he imports think of themselves as superior to the locals. The locals are called the Dakhanis. They are largely, well, some are Muslims. You also have a lot of Marathas, ethnic Marathas. So Marathi-speaking warrior elites. And you also have some slaves or Habshis. And we'll talk about the Marathas and Habshis in a bit. But this Deccani faction and this Persian faction don't get along at all. And they're constantly conspiring to put the other side down. And this keeps playing out till Mahmud Gawan has to get assassinated because the Deccani faction plots against him. But before he dies, Mahmud Gawan has built himself, or built in his name, an enormous madrasa or college or school, if you want to call it, in Bidar, which is modeled along the buildings that you find in Samarkand. And why Samarkand is because in this Persian cosmopolis, the ideal king has been Timur, who has not only been successful in all his conquests everywhere, but he's taken away a number of craftsmen from all the lands he's conquered and built himself this enormous monumental capital at his base of Samarkand. And this will be a lasting influence on buildings everywhere, where even the Mughals, who think of them, the Mughals never call themselves Mughals, they'll call themselves Timurids. And the Mughals will also want to build using features of Timurid architecture, such as these enormous gateways, these big towers, patches of tile work, and so on. In any case, Mahmud Gawan has already, since he's imported a lot of people and he himself has come from Iran, he's very much in connect with the heart of this Persian cosmopolis, and kingship has to emulate that, and he does his best. But there is a local in the court of the Bahmanis, somebody called Nizamul Mulk Bahari, who conspires against him and has him assassinated. And within a few years, this Nizamul Mulk is also assassinated, and his son, who has been a very successful Bahmani general, at that point is ruling the northern province of the Bahmanis, for the Bahmanis, at a place called the Fort of Junnar, which would later be called the Fort of Shivneri. And he immediately declares rebellion and says, this is the indigenous faction which will fight against all these Persians, and therefore I declare independence right here. And his kingdom, at that point, the number of forts he controls and so on, will roughly correspond with Chhatrapati Shivaji 150 years later, who doesn't declare rebellion at the Fort of Junnar, but is born at the Fort of Junnar. And so, being indigenous and fighting foreigners comes in many shades of convenience. Anyway, so this is Junnar, and this is Daulatabad, and Daulatabad is still the prestige seat in the Deccan. And this guy, Ahmad Nizam Shah, who's declared independence, wants to capture Daulatabad. So every year he mounts a campaign. And this campaign, eventually is successful. But in the many years that he campaigns, he finds out that this is a convenient place to stop at, because if you go this way, you cross forests and rivers. You go along these plains, it's an easier route. And at this place, he once beats a Bahmani army and names it Bagh-e-Nizam, and then founds a city and a fort at that location. And so if you go to the fort of Ahmednagar even today, inside the main gate is a dargah to a holy man called Bagh-e-Nizam. And so we don't know if a holy man is actually buried there, but it's some memory that there used to be a place called Bagh-e-Nizam. In any case, he builds a fort and he builds a city right next to it. This is in 1494. And the city he names Ahmednagar. And all the chroniclers of that time keep saying, within 2 years, the city rivaled Baghdad and Cairo in splendor. Not because anybody had been to Baghdad and Cairo, but these are notional tropes. Again, you are being part of that world which has these cities. So you say, these are the cities we compete with. And so if you look, the city is completely separate from the fort where the royal family will live. And that's very unusual. It's unlike any other Sultanate city, and we'll see in a bit why. The kings of Ahmednagar, there are 5 great builders. The first one, Ahmad Nizam Shah, the only thing we have from his reign is really this tomb that he builds for himself. We don't have tombs of all the other kings because his son converts to Shiism, and because they have the means, they have their bodies sent off to Karbala after they die. So he's planned a big necropolis thinking all my descendants will also get buried here. None of them do. Again, this is a story that you're not going to get from texts. You have material evidence for this. His son, Burhan Nizam Shah, the one who converts to Shiism, builds an academy called the Bara Imam Kotla, which is now a slum, and therefore aerial photographs work best, inside which you have some cloisters and a mosque, and we'll talk about that mosque in about 10 minutes. His son, the third Sultan, Hussein Nizam Shah, is the first Sultan for whom we have pictures, and we have portraits of many of the kings after this. He actually gets the fort of Ahmednagar rebuilt in stone, and this is an inscription we found only a couple of years ago, so It should be published in a month or two. And he's also responsible for a number of small but really delicate and beautiful buildings like this mosque. His son, the madman, Murtaza Nizam, about whom we'll hear a lot more, builds a number of palaces. He also leaves behind a number of paintings of himself and also a lot of stories because he is completely insane. There are periods when he chooses to give up all affairs of the court and go and retire and live in one of these palaces. There are times when he suspects his son is trying to overthrow him and tries to, basically burn him alive. He's completely eccentric. And then the last Sultan, Burhan II, leaves behind some buildings and some coins, and that's all we have. After the 1590s, the kingdom of Ahmednagar is under pressure from the Mughals, who will conquer it in 1600. The city will never be theirs again. They move capital to Paranda, to Junnar, and eventually to Daulatabad. And then for the next 20 years, Malik Ambar, the slave general, the Habshi, the Abyssinian, will rule the kingdom of Ahmednagar. His right-hand man will be somebody also at the court of the Nizam Shahs, a general called Shahaji Bhosle. And we'll look at that story in a bit. But let's look at some palaces of the Nizam Shahs and see what they're trying to do in terms of their emulation of the Timurids. So the Timurids were a semi-nomadic pastoral group who loved camping. I mean, being outdoors was very much part of their lifestyle. And even at Samarkand and Herat and all the cities that they controlled, they built themselves palaces in the city, but they really lived most of their lives in these suburban, idyllic palaces. And for some reason, the Nizam Shahs, who are completely urban, who've grown up at court, who have no reason to have that kind of lifestyle, choose never to live in the city, but live in these palaces instead. So the first palace we'll look at is Farah Bagh. Then you have something called Hasht Behesht Bagh. That palace is the one which is close to Beed. And then you have something called Manzar Sumba on top. And so if you look at Farah Bagh, it's one of the most imposing palaces you'll find anywhere from this period, pre-Mughal. It predates the Taj by 50 years. It's very comparable in size and scale. It's set on this enormous platform in the middle of an artificial lake with gardens all around. You can see there are pictures when the lake still had water. There's no water anymore. Inside, it's in ruins, but there is timber framing and then masonry that keeps it all together. There's still a lot of surviving stucco, and it might disappear before long. And these are the comparable plans of, Humayun's tomb, which is the first one, Farah Bagh, which is in the middle, and the Taj at the very end. And you can see how comparable they are in size and type. And that's because this is a plan type called the Hasht Behesht, which you find in Iran and in Central Asia in large numbers. So there is a lineage to this kind of building elsewhere. We know of the date of the palace because of a certain inscription, which gives the date as 1576-77. Mind you, this inscription is not on site. It's actually elsewhere. And why it was removed is because in one of the texts, there is a story saying a courtier called Nemat Khan Samnani was asked by Murtaza Nizam Shah to build this palace. And so he built this palace. And once he built it, people at court who were not happy with him, who were jealous of him, told the king, have that palace demolished because Nemat Khan Samnani is not an honorable man, and he's built it in very triangular ways. And so the palace was demolished and rebuilt in 1583. Now it's impossible that this palace of this scale was pulled down in 3 years and built again. And by triangular, I think this is what happened. You had triangular roofs on top. And where they would have been are the right locations where such roofs can exist. And there is, again, a tradition of building these pyramidal roofs. But right when this palace is built, this seems to go out of fashion throughout the Deccan. Perhaps for astrological reasons, perhaps for who knows what it is, but clearly it's something that nobody wants anymore, and it's gone, and Nemat Khan Samnani falls out of favor, and the top of the palace is demolished and kept flat. These roofs are completely gone. The next palace we'll look at is the Hasht Behisht Bagh. This is just a part of it, but you have this octagonal pavilion, again in the middle of a lake, so you have to boat to all these places. And on the side, you have a set of apartments with a bathhouse attached to it. And again, if you look at it, you know this bathhouse, this hammam, is added later. And this is the place that Murtaza Nizam Shah retired to for 12 years because he wanted to do nothing at court. This whole campus is fantastic because there's a big sewage pit, which was also another set of superb subterranean rooms, above which you have what is called a badgir or a wind catcher. And these towers essentially pull in air, take them down, and cool the water underneath. Again, we have no other examples of this in the Deccan, but I don't know how long this will last. And then you have a number of palaces at this site. The third site is this, which is on top of a hill, very strategically located, overlooking the old road towards Daulatabad. And because it's up on a hillside, the problem is, of course, getting water there. And so halfway down the hillside, you have a set of early cisterns, water tanks, from where you can raise water. And so it's a very elaborate mechanism by which you draw water up and you fill up this enormous pool, which will last you for a long time. You have lovely buildings all around it, like gatehouses and so on. If you look at the stonework in here, it looks like it's done in brick. And this is, again, an example of somebody, the designers, coming in with brick traditions and saying, we want things built in brick. The locals say, no, we are comfortable doing things in stone. So they say, dress your stones like brick, and then we'll talk. And so this is the ensemble of buildings that makes up this hillside palace. The construction is also very strange, which is a complete hybrid of technologies that you really don't see anywhere else, including these strange T-shaped tiles, which are terracotta tiles, which are suspended between wood and so on. Again, a lot of it is falling apart, so right now is the time to see it. You might never see it again. And the fourth site, which is called Kallavantini's Mahal, which in Marathi means the courtesan's palace, because any building without a provenance in Marathi, which is outside town, is immediately thought of as some kind of courtesan's palace. And so this also gets this name. This is about 15 kilometers outside the city. And what you have is an enormous field with pavilions on all sides. And in this area, you find a lot of stones like this, suggesting that animals were being brought here in large numbers and tied. These are tethering stones. And these are the four pavilions which don't exist or survive in great shape. But the pavilion to the north, which has on one side the remains of gardens, seems to be the royal pavilion because it's separated from that field, that arena, by a wall, and the terrace of which is completely accessible on top. And the finishes and decoration is absolutely superb. And so if you look at these four palaces, this one is used for entertaining diplomatic missions. We have descriptions of embassies coming from the Safavids, from various courts. We know of poetry recitals and music recitals at this place. This really is a place where you show off the kind of grandeur your kingdom has. This is not for domestic consumption in that sense. This, on the other hand, is made into a completely residential palace by the Nizam Shahs. This is a strategic lookout location. And the fourth one is something where you probably would have had military reviews, so you line up your troops, or you have animal fights and so on. So you have these pavilions from where you can watch action in a field in the middle. And so the Timurids don't have this. Their palaces are really, some are seasonal, some are for different women from different tribes and so on. Whereas the Nizam Shahs are carefully building their palaces to suit very specific purposes. So they're borrowing from a Timurid legacy, but they've yet made it their own. Now, about mosques in Ahmednagar, all these are Sultanate cities. Some of them might be recognizable. This is Daulatabad, this is Bidar, this is Golconda, this is Ahmedabad, and this is Bijapur. And one feature you find in all of them is that the royal citadel or royal palace is within the city. And so if you look at Ahmedabad, it's at this end. If you look at Golconda, this is where it is. If you look in Daulatabad, it's again this hill. And if you look at Bijapur, it's right in the center. Ahmednagar is going to be different. And they're going to be different because the kings have decided they're going to live in the suburbs in all these gardens, right? And so what they do is they build themselves, we saw that, we'll come back to that map. They build themselves a fort where they live, and they never live in the city. There is actually no mention of the king ever visiting the city. What you have instead is the whole city parceled out into a number of wards. Each one of those wards is given to a nobleman at court and named after him. And what the nobleman does is build himself a big estate, build a market, build a caravanserai, build a mosque, build a bazaar, build a hammam, put together all the things that make up the urban fabric of the city, and declare it successful. And each one of them, or a lot of them, will build small mosques, and that's what you have throughout the city. So when we looked at these Sultanate cities, the other thing that all of them have is a big mosque called a Jami Masjid, where everybody comes together for Friday prayers. And this is very important in the Sultanate model of kingship, because on every Friday there is something called a khutbah, which is you read a royal charter from the Friday mosque. But yet, the Nizam Shahs will never have this. Now, if you look at all these places, Mecca is naturally towards the west, and the palace is towards the western end, and the mosque is to the east of that. So when you pray in the direction of Mecca, in the mosque, you're also praying in the direction of the king's palace. Subtle ways of shaping people's ideas. Ahmednagar doesn't have a single Jami mosque, but a number of these mosques in noblemen's wards, and a number of mosques that are associated with trade groups. So you might have something like Burud Masjid, which means all the people who are working with bamboo build that together. And you have a number of these. Again, like we saw, this is the royal residence and this is the city, exactly inverted because the fort is to the east and there is no Jama mosque. This is a typical nobleman's estate, what remains of it. The same Nemat Khan, this is what remains of his estate. There is a big inscription in here which gives us details of exactly everything that was there and which talks of how his family will control it. This is the scale of mosque you find throughout Ahmednagar. Every mosque is typically 2, 3, 4, 6 bays, no larger than that. Nothing like a Jami mosque. It can hold 30 people inside and 30 people outside. That's the extent. Which is so much in contrast, except for this one, which is the one inside the Bara Imam Kotla. But then this is an academy, so this can hold about 100 people. But again, it's not a Jami mosque by any means. This is the kind of mosque that gets built all through the city. This is a particularly delightful version called the Damri Masjid. And that's because the kings of Ahmednagar have established very good relations with the Safavids of Iran, who, particularly under this king called Tahmasp, are redefining what Shia Islam is going to be. And this is a portrait of Tahmasp. Why Tahmasp is important is because the Mughals have been given refuge. Humayun had to flee Delhi. He had to find refuge at the Safavid court. He finally gathered an army and managed to beat Sher Shah Suri and come back to Delhi. And he owes the Safavids something. Now the Mughals are pressing down south. Akbar is making inroads into the Deccan. If you can somehow establish good connections with the Safavids and convince them to tell the Mughals not to invade the south, it might work. And so these people are desperately Iranocentric. They want to be like the Safavids. They keep saying, we'll send embassies there. In fact, the king of Bijapur even has the khutbah read in the Bijapur Jami Masjid in the name of the Safavid emperor. So there is a lot of appeasement, hoping that there will be gains in terms of arresting Mughal inroads into the Deccan. So our man Murtaza Nizam Shah also very much is modeling himself along the lines of a Safavid. And the Safavids themselves have a cleric called Al-Karaki, who has this whole theological doctrine of why Jami mosques are bad and we don't need them. And so there are no Jami mosques built in Iran through the course of the 16th century, till, of course, you have this guy called Shah Abbas in the early 17th who commissions big things in Isfahan, like that mosque over there. But if the Safavids are not going to have Jami mosques, we are not going to have Jami mosques. And again, this is something that's not explicitly stated. No text says this. But you look at the kind of material evidence that remains, and you see there is such a deliberate attempt at trying to mirror the Safavids in Iran. And there is a constant connection with Safavid Iran by sea, which eventually will get blockaded by the Portuguese. The ways in which they look at Iran, I mean, this is not all about just looking to Iran. There are also lots of Indic things that come in. So obviously you can see this is a very refined style of Persian painting. And this is some attempt at trying to copy the overall composition of that, though done in a way that the geometry is not really understood. And that's because the painting on the right is part of a fantastic album, a codex called the Tarikh-e-Hussein Shah, which is painted and made in the mid-1560s. The ghost you see over here is the queen. It's the wife of this king, Hussein Nizam Shah, and that's his wife, Khunzada Humayun. Why she is erased is because when the king dies, their son, this mad guy, Murtaza, doesn't like her being the regent. She's actually controlling the kingdom. And he says, you know what, I'm going to force her out somehow. And one of the things he does is to take this album and deface her everywhere. So her picture is actually scraped off and overpainted. There's one painting that survives because he doesn't realize it's her. But in any case, the kind of, this is Persian. Yes, the composition tries to copy some of that. But look at the palette, the pinks, the yellows. It's all very local. Look at what these women are holding. Look at how the women are dressed in saris. Most importantly, look at the pose that the king is sitting in with his foot turned upwards, which would be completely insulting in most Islamic courts. But here, we'll just come back to this. Here, this is a complete take on things like a sculptural type of Uma Maheshwar, and also this kind of position where a king sits in a semi-relaxed way with his foot on top is actually described in Bana's Harsha Charitra as to how Harsha sits. This is the way an ideal king will sit with grace in a court. And so somewhere there is a local rootedness which is also filtering in. It's not just looking outwards. This is a cosmopolitanism where you look outwards and you try and fit in with an international world, but you also really appreciate and celebrate your own local. This is the painting where the queen doesn't get wiped out because she's not recognized as the queen. But what she's doing is touching a tree, and the tree has gone into bloom, which is a trope that you have in India, again, a literary trope that finds its translation in the visual arts. And 1,500 years before this painting, you already have it at Sanchi. And so, again, there are things with long continuities which are very much Indic, which also survive with the Nizam Shahs of Ahmednagar. And so it's not just that they take from the world and they take from the local, but they also give. And how they give is the last part of what I'm going to show you. And since we are in Pune and Maharashtra, one of the boxes we must check is the mention of the great Shivaji. And we'll start with his kingdom, which starts off very small over here. And it's taken really in great strides within the next 100 years. We are going to talk about 3 buildings pertaining to the Marathas, 2 of which, the ones on top, are actually samadhis or memorials which look like Islamic tombs. Those are of Shivaji's 2 grandparents, both his grandfathers. And the one at the bottom is a temple built by Shivaji himself for his coronation. And so first, let's go back to the Sultanate of Ahmednagar, which seems to collapse from the 1600s onwards. By 1636, it's gone. And the last person who tries to champion it is actually Shahaji Bhosle, father of Shivaji Maharaj. And he valiantly tries to save it, but he can't. Then he's forced to accept service with the Mughals. Then he later moves to the Bijapur Sultans and so on. And there he's given some lands that Shivaji uses as a basis to really declare independence, using the same core area that Ahmad Nizam Shah did, which is set in high mountains. You can practice guerrilla warfare and set up an independent kingdom. Again, a cause of being indigenous against all these outsiders, something that we've heard the Nizam Shahs always do. Now, the Nizam Shahs claim to be Kulkarnis from a place called Patri in Maharashtra. And they keep fighting battles to get that place back time and again. And this is their claim. Whereas all the other sultanates, the Adil Shahs, the Qutub Shahs, all claim to be from Turkey and from Iran and so on. And so they are local. And as soon as the Nizam Shahi is gone in 1636, within 10 years, a young Shivaji is already setting up a kingdom in exactly that vacuum. Of course, all the portraits we have of him are from elsewhere. We have almost no portraiture, barring one of Lakhuji Jadhav. So the Marathas are all in very important positions at all these Deccan courts, but there is no painting that we find of them. What we also don't find a lot of is their architecture. This is a very composite society in the 16th century and late 17th. You start seeing documents written in Persian and Marathi. You find that a lot of these sultans are marrying into local families, but yet there is no architectural representation in this period. So the two buildings we could find was the Samadhi of Shivaji's paternal grandfather and maternal grandfather. And both of them are in the service of the Nizam Shahs of Ahmednagar. Now the Nizam Shahs of Ahmednagar, though themselves don't build tombs and have their bodies sent off to Karbala, all their courtiers, like Sarje Khan, this is Changiz Khan, the first owner of Malik Ambar, Salabat Khan, Rumi Khan, the guy who cast the Malik-e-Maidan, all of them have tombs built for themselves in the city. And much like these tombs, this is important, this is a saint called Shah Sharif, to whom Shivaji's grandfather goes to saying, I have no children. And this man says, okay, well, you will have them. He gives them whatever. And when the two children are born, he names them after this saint, Shahji and Sharifji. But these are the memorials that Lakhuji Jadhav Rao and Maloji Bhosle will build for themselves. They look exactly like the Islamic tombs that Nizam Shahi nobles build. But in this case, we know, and so one of them is in Ellora, close to Aurangabad, the other one is in Sindkhed Raja. But we know because of certain decorative programs whom they belong to, and there are also other kinds of evidences. But look at the architecture closely. To begin with, this tomb of Lakhuji Jadhav has buried within it, enshrined within it, 4 corners dedicated to his 4 sons who died before him. And all around the tomb are these small samadhis, well, not a tomb, really a memorial, but are these small memorials of other lesser family members. If you look at the details, notice a few things like these splayed feet down here. Look at these kinds of flowers in the spandrels. Look at this thing hanging off a chain. You will find these details across Sultanate monuments all across the Deccan. This is very much embedded in the visual aesthetic and culture of the Deccan. What you'll find at Bijapur, you will find things that resonate with that at Sindkhed Raja. This is at a place called Deulgaon Raja. Another branch of the Jadhav Raos lives there. Sometime in the 17th century, one of the ladies of that family dies, and they build a samadhi for her, a memorial. If you did not have that label at the bottom, you could be completely forgiven for thinking this was a Muslim tomb. Again, look at that same architectural vocabulary of the splayed feet, the clustered columns, the minarets, the domes. If you want to see a Maratha memorial like this, a samadhi like this, close to Pune, go to the temple at Wagholi. And Pilaji Jadhav has a samadhi built for himself, which looks very similar to this. Again, the similarities with the architecture of Bijapur, you start comparing these kinds of details everywhere, and you'll see they're using the same motifs, the same ornaments, the same forms, and possibly have the same ideas of what it means to memorialize. It's not about whether you bury or you burn ceremonially on a pyre. The idea is how you remember. Shivaji's paternal grandfather, right outside the temple of Krishneshwar. So Ellora is their watan, it's their paternal village that's given to them as inam. And right besides this temple, which is rebuilt in the 18th century by Ahilyabai Holkar, the temple of Krishneshwar, is this samadhi of Maloji Bhosle. Now, if you look at the temple, there are 3 of these samadhis around it, possibly of various family members. The other 2 have not been identified. And a little distance away, a few kilometers away at Khuldabad, you see the same kind of thing. Here's a holy man where you have divine power, and then you have tombs or memorials all around it, because that's how you derive divine power. What do the Bhosles do with the temple of Krishneshwar, which is their patron deity here? The same thing, they arrange their tombs in the same way so as to receive a similar kind of barakat, if one may. You look at architectural details of all kinds, again, very similar to things you might find in the other sultanates. Again, I want to wind up in time, so let me rush through. But there are lots of unidentified tombs all around the Sultanate areas. And I would not be surprised if a number of them actually are Maratha samadhis. And so this is, again, since we've labeled everything very conveniently, saying if it has a dome, it has to be Muslim. If it is a minaret, it has to be Muslim. I have a whole thing on how the kind of original Maratha temples of the 18th century all have domes and minarets. Architectural vocabulary doesn't follow religious discourse. It usually follows habits of workmen, architectural practices. Forms have their own life. They come to mean different things at different points in time. Now, the last building we'll look at is this temple that was built on the fort of Raigad, a fort that was largely upgraded by Shivaji for his own coronation so that he could be equal to all the kings, as he had built himself an important kingdom. And so this temple, called Jagdishvara, which is Lord of the whole universe, is appropriate for somebody who's planning his coronation there. It does not follow any of the prescriptions of a temple in terms of its massing, in terms of its overall appearance or form. Now, this is somebody who's crowning himself as a Hindu king and has a temple purpose-built for that purpose, and yet it looks nothing except a piece of Sultanate architecture. The massing is actually similar to things like the Ibrahim Roza in Bijapur. If you look at the way things are paved, this is the kind of paving you'll see across Adil Shahi and Nizam Shahi buildings. What do you have on top? A dome and 2 minarets. And very importantly, if you look at the doorway to the temple, of course you have the Ganesha, and then on 2 sides flanking it are 2 minarets to welcome you in. And so the Nizam Shahs lived in a multicultural world, one in which Indic and Persianate ideals and practices created a very composite and pluralistic society, borrowing from a much greater Persian cosmopolis of the Timurids and then of the Safavids. The Nizam Shahs also claimed to have the mantle of being the indigenous people against foreigners. Now, Shivaji goes to the Qutub Shah Sultans, lives in Golconda for a month, and they basically have an agreement saying, let's keep all these people from Hindustan out, let's keep the Mughals out. And there is a definite pride in being Deccani. The Nizam Shahs had the mantle of being indigenous against outsiders, initially the Persian emigres against which they rebel, and later the Hindustani Mughals. But while the political contingencies of such xenophobia yielded convenient results, first in establishing a kind of sovereign rule, and later in resisting Mughal expansion in the Deccan, culturally and materially, you see a great continuum between the Yadavas, the Bahmanis, the Nizam Shahs, and then the Marathas. The Marathas were firmly embedded in the political and social milieu of the Deccan from the 15th to the 17th centuries. The Maratha Sardars worked for various sultans, had differences between themselves. They make alliances, they break alliances. Eventually, the two groups which have been marginalized at the Sultanate courts, the Marathas and the Habshis, are the ones who will gain the most power over the Deccan. The Habshis will rule from Janjira, the Marathas will rule from this region, and they will never get along. So it's ironic that Malik Ambar, who sets up the commanders at Janjira, and Shahaji Bhosle, whose son Shivaji will found the Maratha kingdom, are actually on very good terms and fighting together to save the Nizam Shahi kingdom. But the minute both are gone, the offshoots of those two become sworn enemies. In any case, so early Maratha architecture is no distinct from that of the Sultanates. And the Sultanates have had an agenda which is very cosmopolitan in its outlook. But it's very unfortunate that the historiography of this region has been unable to accommodate the early Marathas within a cultural complex that includes the Timurids and the Safavids. Thank you.